Today we're going to pick up with Unit 2 of Biology 102, and that's going to be Plant and Fungi Diversification. So plants are just going to be a branch of Eukarya. If you remember what Eukarya is, that's going to be the domain that we talked about previously when we talked about our bacteria, our archaea, and then we have the Eukarya. With the Eukarya, if you remember, these are going to be organisms that can be single cellular or it could be a multicellular organism, and they do contain a nucleus with organelles. Now, as far as a plant's going to be a multicellular eukaryotic organism, and it's going to produce its own food by carrying out photosynthesis using energy from the sunlight to convert carbon dioxide and water into sugar. Now with this, it's then going to have its embryo that's going to develop within the protected environment of a female parent. And so plants are going to occur almost exclusively on land, and they're going to vary in size from about 0.4 hundredths of an inch or 1 millimeter to about 380 feet tall. So they have a huge range in size. Plants are also going to usually be located in a specific place where they're not going to move around, and that's going to be referred to as sessile. So sessile means that they are going to be anchored to a specific spot. And most of these, like we said, are going to be terrestrial. Now you do have plants that you will find in water, but most of them will be found on land. And we've also said they are multicellular. So most plants are going to make their own food. However, they can't live on carbon alone. They're also going to need some other things. So they're going to use nitrogen to help build proteins that plants need. Plants will need proteins along with other organisms like humans and animals and other things such as protists. They also need phosphorus, and that phosphorus is going to help make them ATP. And remember, with ATP, you're going to have the adenine triphosphate. It's going to have 3 phosphates attached to that molecule. And when you break that third phosphate off, that's what's going to release the energy that it's going to use to do whatever work it needs to do within its cell. If you need to create ATP, you have the ADP molecule with just 2 phosphates, and you will hook that third phosphate on, and that's going to store energy for it to use in another reaction later on. Also, it's going to need salts that are going to create concentration gradients between the inside and outside of the plant. That's going to be important. If there's more salt on the outside or more solutes on the outside, the water will come out and it could cause the plant to wither. If there are more solutes inside, then that's going to cause it to bring in more water into that cell. Always remember that water follows the solutes. So if the solutes are more on the outside, it's going to pull water out. If the solutes are going to be higher concentrations on the inside, it's going to pull the water into the cell. Roots and shoots. So plants are going to use roots to obtain needed nutrients and substances from the soil. All the water and everything that plant needs does come from the soil. So if you were to, let's say, spray the leaves of a plant, when you spray those leaves, it is not going to be able to take in any of that water, even though water does exit through the pores. It can only absorb the water up through the roots. And so it comes in from the bottom, goes through the system, through the stem, out to the leaves, and then can evaporate through the stomata in the leaves, but it can't go in. The shoots are going to consist of stem and leaves. The stem is going to be a structure support, and the leaves are going to be the main photosynthetic organism, and it also has to deal with releasing oxygen, and it's going to release that water vapor within the stomata there. Right, so looking here, we see over evolutionary time, the daughter has lost its chlorophyll and it can't conduct photosynthesis. So it's going to steal the nutrients from that plant that it's going to grow around, and it's going to use that nutrients for itself. So it's going to kind of act like a parasitic plant there. So stationary living creatures are going to have challenges. if they can't get up and move around, they're sessile, remember, how are they going to get the things that they need? Well, they're going to have to rely on sunlight. So let's say something comes along and it starts to block that sunlight. These plants are going to be able to bend and grow towards that light and enable themselves to be able to get the most light that's going to be efficient for their photosynthetic properties. If you were to take a plant like this lucky bamboo that you see in the picture, every few days you could move it around and it will start to grow in a circular formation because it is following the light. Another challenge of a sessile or stationary lifestyle is going to be that in order to reproduce, the male and female plants can't actually go up and meet up with each other. So they're going to have to figure out a way to get those gametes together to produce a new plant, new organism. So they've developed ways of getting that male gamete to the female gamete, including what they call alternating haploid and diploid stages of life. So alternation of generations is what we refer to that as. And they're going to use other organisms to transport male gametes. So they might use things such as bees or other pollinators. They could use birds or they could use moths. And sometimes they use the wind or they'll use water. Another problem is that they can't run away from any predation. So they can't get away from anything that might attack them or eat them or destroy them. So they have to come up with other ways to protect themselves. So since they can't run from predators, they might develop something such as a thorn that might deter them because it would hurt the predator. Or they might create some sort of poison or some sort of substance within themselves that would be poisonous to whatever was trying to eat them. So the earliest land plants are going to be the first multicellular organisms to live on land. They're going to be simple, non-vascular plants. They have no vessels to transport water or nutrients, so we won't see any xylem or phloem at this point. That's going to be the vessels that transport these things. And then we'll see subsequent evolution of these plants where they have a series of radiations of forms in which the characteristics that made them increasingly independent of water start to come about. So with these, the evolutionary tree of plants is going to show these stages clearly. The first stage is going to be the development of a vessel. That's going to be able to conduct water from the soil and bring it up through the plant. Now it can conduct that water through the plant. It's going to be able to grow much taller because it doesn't need to be closer to the ground where that water is, since it didn't have vessels before. With its seeds, it's going to be able to provide nutrients to get that new plant off to a good start. Within that seed, it's going to have all of the food that it needs until it's able to come up above the soil and start to photosynthesize for itself. And these are going to be the start of gymnosperms. And the third thing is flowers. It's going to allow plants to entice or trick insects and birds and other animals into spreading plants or the male gametes. And this is going to be the evolution of what we know as angiosperms. So looking at this chart here, we can go through and decide, does the plant have vessels to transport water and nutrients? If it's no, then it's going to be the non-vascular plants, which were the first ones to appear. And so what you're looking at right there is moss. Then, moving on, if your answer was yes, then you go to the next question. Does the plant produce seeds? If it does not, then it's going to be a vascular seedless plant, and that's going to be the first to develop within the vascular plants. And so you're seeing there is going to be a fern. Now going to the next one, if it was yes, you ask your next question. Does the plant produce flowers and fruit? If it's no, then it's going to be a gymnosperm. So those are going to be things like your evergreens, your pine trees, things such as that. If it was yes, then that's going to be your angiosperms. And so those are going to be the most recently developed plants that we see come about. So colonizing land is going to bring new opportunities and new challenges for plants. First, we have what's referred to as the Coleochaetes. These are going to be the algae. They're aquatic ancestor of land plants. They're going to be multicellular photosynthetic eukaryotes. And so all that means is it's going to be made up of multiple cells. It makes its own food. And since it's a eukaryote, it does have a nucleus and organelles. So these are going to live only in the water or in very moist surfaces close to the water. They do not require specialized structures to obtain water and nutrients. So the water is going to enter their cells through osmosis. That's going to be a specialized diffusion of just water that goes across the cell membrane into the cell. And the nutrients that they require are going to be in the solution of water that surrounds them. So that's where they're going to take everything in. So some green algae, such as sea lettuce and stoneworts, are even going to look like plants, but they're not going to be plants. They're going to be the Coleochaetes. And so here's a picture of one of these. It's a type of green algae. And so it's going to be the ancestor of plants that began to transition from water to land. So the first land plants are going to appear about 475 million years ago. So when these plants emerged onto land, they're going to face the same two challenges that terrestrial animals are going to face 25 million years later. So plants come first, then we'll see the animals. One problem, they're going to be exposed to gravity. Remember, in water, you're not going to have the same gravitational pull. You're going to be more buoyant. Same thing with plants. So the earliest plants are going to have to grow very close to the ground. And these are going to be things such as mosses, like we have today, that you can find lots of times in the woods. And they're going to be able to resist that pull of gravity because they're not going to grow very tall. Another problem is desiccation. Desiccation is going to be the drying out of the plant. And so the adaptation to that is they're going to develop a waxy outer layer called a cuticle that's going to cover the entire surface of that plant. Mosses and other non-vascular plants are going to lack vessels for transporting nutrients and water. So looking at these non-vascular plant examples are going to be things such as moss, hornworts, and liverworts. Common characteristics that you'll see in these types of plants is that they distribute water and nutrients throughout the plant by diffusion. That's where things cross directly across the cell membrane. They're going to release haploid spores. And remember back from Bio 101, haploid means it has half the genetic information. And so if it has half the genetic information, let's use humans for example, we have 46 chromosomes. So half of that genetic information would be 23 chromosomes. So that would be a haploid. Let's say the plant maybe had 12 chromosomes, so its haploid might be 6. And so the life cycle with these type of organisms is going to go back and forth between the haploid and then the diploid generation. And we're going to refer to this as alternation of generations. And basically that's a life cycle of alternating haploid and diploid generations in which the diploid embryo is going to be protected by the haploid female. Now with the moss life cycle, you see that spongy part there, that's what most of us associate with moss. That is going to be the haploid form. And then hovering above it on the stalks are going to be the spore capsules. And those are going to be the diploid form. And so this is going to be how these types of plants were able to produce and reproduce without having animals to help them out. All right, so what's going to happen is with the first step, when there's sufficient water on the leaves, such as after rainfall, sperm are going to swim from the male reproductive structure to the female reproductive structure, where they're then going to fertilize the eggs. Step 2, that diploid embryo is going to form and develop into an adult diploid moss. Step 3, the diploid moss is going to develop a capsule, which is going to burst and release haploid spores. And step 4, that haploid spore is going to land on moist soil and is going to grow into an adult haploid moss. So with these mosses, things such as peat can be dried and then burned as a fuel to heat homes. And here we see it also being used when creating a traditional Scotch whiskey. And they're going to use that and burn it when they're distilling that whiskey, and it gives it a smoky type flavor. And so those are going to be 2 ways that we can use these types of organisms. Also, mosses are going to be important components. Sorry about that. So here we see mosses are going to be important components of helping with keeping things such as trees and other plants in place. It helps with the soil erosion so that these things aren't stripped away by the wind or by rain or water. So the evolution of vascular tissue is going to make large plants possible. So like we said before, they received water directly from the environment into the cells through osmosis, which is a type of specialized diffusion for water. Now, as plants develop these vascular structures, they're now going to be able to take water from the ground and all the way up to their leaves, so they're able to grow taller. And they're actually going to be able to grow up to 380 feet tall. So here we're going to see some common characteristics once these vascular seedless plants develop. Like we said, they distribute water, and they're going to be able to bring in nutrients through their root system and distribute it throughout the entire plant. So they're going to develop their own type of circulatory system. They're going to release haploid spores, which are going to be dispersed by the wind, and they're going to grow to produce gametes. The life cycle, unlike in animals, with multicellular haploid and diploid phases. And so members of these, we're going to have the ferns, and then we're going to have horsetails. With the fern life cycle, the adult ferns are going to release haploid spores, which are going to be carried by the wind to the new location. The second step, that spore is going to land on moist soil and is going to grow into a haploid fern called a prothallus. Next, when there is going to be a sufficient amount of water on the leaves, such as after rainfall, that sperm is going to be able to swim from the male reproductive structure to the female reproductive structure, where it's then going to fertilize the egg. Next, the last step, that diploid embryo is going to form and is going to continue to grow into an adult diploid fern. So what exactly is a seed? So with these seeds, they're actually going to be an embryonic plant with its own supply of water and nutrients, which are going to be encased in a protective covering. So looking here at this structure, you see the fertilization is going to produce a diploid seed, which is going to contain a multicellular embryo and is going to store a certain amount of carbohydrates in there. Those carbohydrates are going to feed that embryo until it's able to come up above the soil and start to undergo photosynthesis. Now, these carbohydrates are going to be referred to as the endosperm. So that's going to be the food that's going to keep that plant going until it's able to make its own food. And then you see the embryo inside. Now with the growth, you're going to have a seedling that draws energy from that endosperm, like we said, while its leaves start to grow upwards, and then its roots are going to grow downwards. And those roots will start to spread out and make a good anchoring system for that plant. Along with anchoring, it's then going to start to absorb water and nutrients from the soil. So sometimes they're referred to as seeds being goodbye gifts from the parent original plant. They're going to have their own DNA or RNA. They also will contain a few proteins. They're going to be multicellular. It's also going to have its own stored nutrients. Like we said, it's going to have that endosperm in there, which is going to be carbohydrates. Then that nutrient tissue. You're going to have two groups of seed-producing plants. You have one that's referred to as the gymnosperms. These are going to be your pines, firs, and redwoods. Then you're going to have a group called the angiosperms. These are going to be all of the flowering plants and trees. So, do plants have sex? And how are seeds actually going to be formed? Well, as we know, plants can't actually get up, they can't go find a mate, they can't walk around, so they're going to have to be able to bring those two gametes together in order to form another organism of their type. And so we have what's referred to as the gametophyte. It's going to be a life stage that produces haploid gametes. Pollen grains and ovules are going to be these gametes. The pollen's going to produce a pollen tube that's going to grow into the ovule. So the pollen's going to be the male part, and the ovule is going to be where we have the female. The external layer of the ovule is then going to form that seed coat that's going to go around and help to protect it. Now, when it comes time for seed dispersal, the only opportunity that most plants are going to have is going to have things either such as water or rain at first. Then we have animals develop, and then the animals will be able to spread those seeds around. So seeds and seed pods, like we said, are going to have many ways to do this. We have that forceful send-off. Sometimes you'll see an explosion if you've ever watched any National Geographic or Science Channel episodes when you're watching different plants. The seeds are going to hitch rides sometimes on passing animals. So you might have what we refer to as those hitchhikers, or they might have some type of prickly coating that's going to stick to the fur or stick to part of that animal. And then sometimes they can float in water, or they could almost fly. So with the evolution of the seed, gymnosperms are going to become the dominant plants on Earth. Now with the gymnosperms, these are going to be things such as our conifers. That's going to be things like the pine trees. We also are going to have our cicates, we have the genetophytes, and we're going to have ginkgos. Common things with these types of gymnosperms is that they distribute water and nutrients throughout the plant with their own circulatory system, so their vessels have developed. They're also going to have reproductive structures called cones that are going to produce gametes, and fertilization is going to produce seeds. So looking at these groups of gymnosperms, we can then divide them into their own classifications with their own specific characteristics. With the conifers, they're going to be most commonly found in colder temperatures and sometimes drier regions of the world. We're going to find them commonly having needle-shaped leaves. They're going to be an important source of timber, so we use these in a lot of building supplies. And like we said, that's going to include our pines. It also has our spruces, firs, cedars, hemlock, yews, larches, and cypresses. The cicates are going to be slow-growing gymnosperms, and these are going to be found in tropical and subtropical regions, so where it's a lot warmer and more rain. Most are going to resemble palm trees, and then several species are going to be facing extinction actually because they have been cut down. The genetophytes are going to be composed of 3 groups, and these are going to be a shrub-like type of plant, and sometimes they're used in herbal remedies or old recipes. Next we have our ginkgos, and this is going to be only one species that we have left. It has distinctive fan-shaped leaves, and the outer covering of the seed is going to emit a foul odor. When looking at cones, cones aren't just going to contain spores or pollen. They also will have female cones. And so looking here, you see the difference between the male and female cone. The male cone does release the pollen grains that require the wind to take it to the female cone. And most of the time when you think of a pine tree or a conifer, you often think of the pine cone that you see, that's the female. Now the female cone is going to have ovules that are going to be on those protruding scales. And so they're going to become fertilized when the spores from the sperm actually land on them. So it says, although billions of pollen grains are wasted for each one that fertilizes an egg, gymnosperms have successfully used pollination or wind pollination for more than 200 million years. Now looking at the gymnosperm life cycle, it's going to be done in 4 steps. So starting with the first step, the male cone is going to release pollen grains that are going to be dispersed by the wind to the ovules that are going to be found beneath the scales on those female cones. The pollen grain is then going to release sperm that fertilizes an egg within the ovule. Fertilization is going to create a diploid embryo that matures into a seed, and eventually that seed is going to be released from the female cone and is going to grow into an adult tree. The conifer is going to include the tallest and longest living trees. They're going to have some of the widest geographic ranges and the greatest number of species within the gymnosperms. And so looking here, you can see that this redwood can reach up to 380 feet tall. And then you could look at the one below, and that one's going to be one of the oldest type of conifers that's out there. It's a bristlecone pine, and it can live up to 4,800 years. So how can trees grow large and live to great ages? Well, we have the woody plants that can be exceptionally strong, so it helps them resist an attack by herbivores, so they're more likely to live. They have what's referred to as heartwood. That's going to be a core of dead tissue that contains complex cross-linked molecules, so it's going to give it a nice tough structure and make it strong. It's going to have bark on the outside, which is going to cover it up, and it sheds without damaging the tree. And it's also going to protect that living tissue within the tree. And it will exude sometimes a sticky pitch or a pine pitch. That can be used for defense, so it could actually capture any type of insect that's been eating away at the plant, or it could also deter animals because they don't like the stickiness to it or they don't like the taste of it. Flowering plants are going to be the most diverse and successful plants, and actually they're going to be the most dominant that we see around today, around the world. So with angiosperms are going to be the dominant plants that we find everywhere. We're going to see these in most of our trees that are going to be fruiting trees, flowering trees, or trees such as maples and oaks and things such as that. So common characteristics is that they're going to distribute water and nutrients throughout the plant. They're also going to have a circulatory system with vascular tissue. They have those flowers, which are going to be the production of those gametes, and the seeds are going to be enclosed within an ovary. And so members of these are going to be flowering trees, bushes, herbs, and grasses. Now, structures within the flower that we're going to see is you're going to have your male reproductive parts. You have what's referred to as the anther. That's going to be on top that has the pollen sac, or what produces the pollen. You're going to have the filament, which is going to be the supporting stalk that anther is going to sit on. With the female parts, it's referred to as the carpel. Sorry, I meant to say the male is referred to as the stamen, and it is made up of the anther and filament. Female parts are going to be the carpel, and it's going to be made up of the stigma, which is going to be a sticky tip. You have the style, which is going to be the long tube-like structure, and then you're going to have the ovary at the bottom of it, which contains the ovules. Now, surrounding it, you're going to have petals that could be of many different colors, and then you'll have the small little green leaves that you see that surround those flowers, and they're referred to as sepals. So most plants combine the male and the female reproductive structures in the same flowers. Like we said, the male structure, the stamen, has the anther, which is going to produce that pollen, and it's sitting on top of the filament, which is the stalk. The female reproductive structure within the flower is going to be called the carpel, and it's going to be made up of the pistil, which has an enclosed chamber called an ovary at the base that contains one or more ovules in which eggs are going to develop. A stalk, or the style, is going to extend from the ovary, and it's going to have a sticky tip on top of it, which is going to help it capture pollen, and that's referred to as the stigma. So a flower is nothing without a pollinator. And so to help pollinate these eggs that are going to be found within the female carpel, you're going to have to see some of the different things that these plants do. They will sometimes use trickery. It will look like it is, for example, with this picture on the left, it looks like it's a bee, but it's not actually a bee. This is going to be an orchid flower that's going to deceive a male bee into thinking that it's a female bee. And so when he lands on it, he is going to try to mate with this female bee. Before he knows it and realizes it's not a female bee, he will be covered in the pollen, and he's going to then take it and deliver it to another orchid that he's going to think is a female. They also will use things such as bribery. So some plants are going to offer something of value to that animal, and so they're going to bribe the animal to carry the pollen from one plant to another. Here you're going to see this bee is going to be covered in pollen, and he's actually there searching for nectar, and he's going to use that nectar as a food source. So why are some flowers so flashy? Well, it's because of this trickery and bribery. And so with that trickery, like we said, that was plant deceit, is going to trick the insects into carrying pollen from one plant to the next. We saw the orchid there. It resembled a female wasp. The male wasp will ride it like a bucking bronco, and by the time it's done, it is covered in pollen and it will go to the next orchid. You also have the bribery. With the bribery, it's going to offer something of value to that insect. So it has a sticky pollen. The flower is then going to catch the attention of the pollinator, and something of value that that pollinator is going to want is going to be the nectar, and it's going to use the nectar as a food source. So some plants and animals are going to co-evolve together, and so you'll see this with flowers and their pollinators. And so they change over time, and the plant will resemble the pollinator or attract the pollinator in some way in order to have it come over and help carry its pollen to the next plant or to get fresh pollen that came from another plant. And so one thing it's going to use, we have colors and patterns. And so white is going to be there for nocturnal pollinators such as moths and bats. If you have bright colors, that's going to be there for visually oriented pollinators, things such as birds, butterflies, and bees. If you have certain odors, you're going to have like sweet is going to be pollinators with a good sense of smell, such as moths, butterflies, and bees. If it's stinky, that's going to be pollinators that are looking for things like rotten meat, and that's where they're going to want to lay their eggs, so things like flies will look for these. If it has no odor at all, this is going to be for pollinators with a poor sense of smell, such as birds. Flower structure, if it has a tube, this is going to be for pollinators with long tongues, such as moths or butterflies. If it's going to be intricate or closed up, that's for pollinators such as bees that will crawl around inside. If it has nectar, and a lot of nectar, it's going to be for pollinators with high energy needs, because nectar, of course, is going to be a carbohydrate made of sugars. So it will have a lot of energy within the substance. And that will be for things such as birds, bees, and butterflies. If it doesn't have nectar, this is going to be for pollinators such as flies that are simply looking for a place to lay their eggs, or for beetles looking for petals and pollen and other parts to eat. So angiosperms are going to improve seeds with double fertilization. So what this is, you have an embryo and a substantial ready-made food source that's going to be there for it. So the process of fertilization, you're going to have the fusion of two gametes to form a zygote. A zygote is going to be when the sperm and the egg come together, and it is a one-celled organism at that moment. It will further on go into division of mitosis, where it becomes a multicellular organism and develops into that plant. So it's going to begin with a pollen grain landing on the stigma of the flower. So in an angiosperm, this process is going to be called double fertilization. That's going to be where there's going to be two separate fusions of male nuclei with the female nuclei. With double fertilization, it's going to be a more efficient system than what we saw with the gymnosperms, because whenever an embryo is produced at fertilization, and only then, it can be more substantial and have a ready-made food source. So one's actually going to create the embryo, and one's going to help with the food source. And so looking here, we're going to go through the process of an angiosperm life cycle. The first thing that happens is the pollen grain is going to be released from the male anther of the flower, delivering the male haploid gamete to the stigma. Then that sticky tip is going to capture that pollen, and then it's going to send it down the pollen tube. So that pollen grain produces the pollen tube that extends through the stigma to the ovary. Meanwhile, you're going to have a cell within the ovule undergoing meiosis, forming 4 haploid cells called spores. 3 of these usually are going to degenerate. The surviving haploid spore is going to undergo mitosis, forming an embryo sac that contains 7 haploid cells. One cell is going to become the egg. Another cell with 2 nuclei will form the endosperm following fertilization by a sperm. So that's going to create the food. When the pollen tube reaches the ovule, 2 sperm are going to be released in the process called double fertilization. One of the 2 sperms is going to fuse with the egg to form a zygote, and then the other sperm is going to fuse with the two nuclei in the middle of the embryo sac, and it's going to form that endosperm, which is going to nourish that embryo until it's able to grow above ground and go through photosynthesis. So the zygote and the endosperm are going to continue to develop within the ovule, forming a seed that will eventually be released and grow to a mature plant. So what advantage does double fertilization give to angiosperms? Well, there's going to be two important advantages. It initiates the formation of endosperm only when an egg is fertilized, so it saves energy. And smaller gametes can be produced, so it ensures that the seeds are going to be produced quickly. So you're going to have haploid and diploid stages looking here that we went over. We had haploid and diploid stages with non-vascular plants, that's the moths. Then we had vascular seedless plants that came about, and that's where that haploid and diploid stages are both multicellular and physically independent of one another. Then we moved on to the gymnosperms, and that's the evolution of seeds, almost completely eliminating the prominent haploid stage seen in mosses and ferns. And then the angiosperms formed. And so those are going to have haploid gametes that are going to further reduce in size and enables more rapid seed production. So do flowers with both male and female structures fertilize themselves? Well, we have what's called outbreeding versus inbreeding. So outbreeding is where it's going to mate with other plants. Inbreeding is where it can fertilize itself. So outbreeding, we said combination of haploid cells from two different individuals produces offspring that are going to have greater genetic diversity. And that means that with the greater genetic diversity, it might have a greater chance of survival because it can change according to conditions. So offspring that result from inbreeding are going to be a combination of male and female gametes from the same individual. And so since it's from the same individual, it's not going to have a different variation of alleles, and so it's going to be the same as its parent. So angiosperms are going to have a variety of ways to increase the chance that only sperm from another individual will fertilize the female gamete. Plants that have male and female reproductive structures sometimes are going to be in different flowers or even on different individuals. So you might have a plant that is producing the male parts at one time and a plant that's producing the female structures. And it's going to increase the chance that a pollen grain lands on the stigma coming from a different plant because it does not want to self-fertilize. To prevent self-fertilization, sometimes the anthers may mature before the stigma, and so the stigma is not going to be ready to receive that pollen grain when the anther is active, and so it will move on to a plant that is ready to receive it. And when the stigma becomes functional, the anthers are no longer going to be producing pollen, so it's going to be more likely to get pollen from a different plant. Also, we have what's referred to as molecular recognition system. That's going to prevent inbreeding. So proteins on the surface of the stigma are not going to allow the pollen from the same individual to go into the pollen tube. Only if it is different genetically will it allow that to happen. So plants and animals are going to have a love-hate relationship with each other. They don't necessarily want to be eaten and destroyed by the animal, but then again, they are going to rely on the animal to distribute its offspring or its seeds. So it's going to use things like fleshy fruits. It's going to bribe these plants to eat that seed and to carry it off to a different area. We have them that hitch rides. So you see here that some of these seed pods are going to have spines or projections that are going to attach to passing animals. Sometimes they can fly or float, so they'll create structures that allow them to be carried away by the wind. And they provide a food source. So like we said, they may actually eat the seed, and some seeds require going through the digestive system of an animal and being deposited with their fecal matter, which is going to be like a ready-made fertilizer for it. And then some of them are just going to carry it away and eat it at a different spot, and they'll deposit that seed once they're done with the fleshy fruit. So how does it work? So fruits are going to be colorful, and red is going to be the most common color. They're going to first attract the animal, And then because they have such high sugar content, lots of carbs, they're going to taste good, be nice and sweet. And so the animal's going to want to eat that fleshy fruit. And it also is good for them. So not only does it give them nutrients, but it also gives them enough calories to help them run the system of their body. So can seeds still sprout after being eaten by an animal? Yes, it can. And you can actually test that yourself if you would like. So, unable to escape, plants must resist predation in other ways. So some ways we have, like we said, the anatomical structure. So some plants are going to have spines on them or spikes. They'll have thorns. These will help deter predators. Some will have thick layers of bark that they'll be able to shed in order to get rid of attacking insects. Some actually have sticky traps, so they'll have things such as resin, or they'll have sap that'll come out. And then others will have chemical compounds. So some of these chemical compounds will actually either cause irritation or rash, or it could cause the animal to actually become physically ill, like a poison. Others might actually cause pain to the animal, like the stinging nettle. So with chemical defenses, lots of these, even though they're there to deter animals, we actually can use them as medicines or medicinal plants. We have salicine, that's going to be found in bark. It's going to actually help relieve pain. That's what we find in things like aspirin, and that's actually found in the bark of a willow tree. We have opium, which is going to be a strong pain reliever, and this is going to be found in the poppy flower. We have digitalin, and that's going to help slow the heart rate. We have impica, which is going to induce vomiting. And then we have bioprospecting, and that's going to be plants with medicinal uses that are going to be sought after. So with bioprospecting, lots of times you'll hear people like we looked at the ginkgo plant. They actually go out and they look for these ginkgo plants throughout heavily forested places in order to collect them for medicinal purposes. It's supposed to help with vitality. It's supposed to help with your memory. And so it's been used for thousands of years. And that's one of those that lots of people go out bioprospecting. Insect attack, sometimes you have to use these volatile chemicals to either warn off an impeding threat or call protective insects to come help you if you're a plant. So plants can also warn nearby plants by producing these chemicals. One of them is referred to as MJ, and is going to summon parasitic wasps that deposit their eggs inside of caterpillars that are eating away at their leaves. And so then the larvae are going to eat the caterpillars from the inside out. Here you're going to have some plants living in nitrogen deficient soil that have to be able to get nitrogen somewhere. And so what they're going to do is they become predators to insects. And so they're going to be able to trap insects, use a chemical or a enzymatic juice that they have, and it's going to break down the bodies of these insects and use the nitrogen from their bodies. So fungi and plants are going to be partners, but they're not going to be relatives. Lots of times they might look closely related, but they're not. So fungi is going to be another group of the eukarya. They're going to actually be more closely related to animals than they are to plants. So you need to know that. So fungi are going to be decomposers or symbionts. Sometimes you might refer to them as detrivores. And that's something that eats decaying dead matter, or that decaying dead matter could be referred to as detritus. And so fungi are going to acquire their energy by breaking down the tissue of dead organisms or by absorbing nutrients from living organisms. They're going to be sessile, so they're going to be stuck where they're at. They cannot move from place to place, and they're anchored to that organism that they're going to feed on. They're also going to have cell walls made of chitin. Now, chitin is going to be a carbohydrate. That's actually going to be an indigestible carbohydrate, kind of like chlorophyll. So the body can't break that down in most animals. And so with these cell walls that have chitin in them, it's going to be important to help produce kind of like an exoskeleton in insects as well, like we said. So here on the group, we have our plants, we have our animals, and so you see how the fungi and animals are going to be more closely related than those plants. So some different familiar fungi that you might be able to recognize. You have portobello mushrooms. Lots of people like to use those in cooking and to eat. Penicillin is going to be made from Mycelium notatum, and so that's going to be one that we use to make a antibiotic that's going to be very prevalent. It is actually found on black bread mold. And then we have the yeast that we use to actually make breads, and I actually use it in different types of experiments. So that one's going to be the Candida, and that is going to be commonly used in baking. So fungi are most likely arose from a unicellular flagellated aquatic protist, they think more than about 500 million years ago, but could actually be as long ago as 1.3 billion years. We're just not sure. We haven't found any fossilized records that we can go back to, but this is their age range that they're thinking. So close to 100,000 species have been described. We have a total number of species that's going to be estimated about 1.5 million. So most common fungi. First, we have our yeast. These are going to be the only single-celled fungi that we have. We also have truffles and morels, and they're going to be found in the phylum Oscomycota. Next, we have mushrooms, and they're going to be in the phylum Basidiomycota. Then you have your molds, which are not going to be a phylogenetic grouping. These are going to be things we have like penicillin. That's going to be a source of antibiotics. They're going to be in the phylum Oscomycota too. We have the black bread molds. We have the monophyletic phylum, the Zygomycota. So fungi are going to have some structures in common, but they exploit an enormous diversity of habitats. And so you might wonder, what is a mycelium? Most fungi, like we said, are going to be multicellular, and they're going to be composed of long strings of barely visible thread-like hyphae. And these cells are going to be interconnected, and they form a mass of tissue. This mass of tissue is called a mycelium. This is going to be the form in which a fungus is going to spend most of its time. Usually, it's going to be underground or in something like a decaying log. So unless you dug down to reach the mycelium, you don't even realize that it's going to be there. So looking at a fungus life cycle. First, it's going to be underground. It's going to be a distinct haploid hyphae, which is going to be the string-like structures. They're going to fuse and form a dikaryotic hyphae, in which single cells have two distinct nuclei. The dikaryotic hyphae state can last for years, and then the mycelium then starts to spread within an area. At some point, the reproductive structure, which is going to be the mushroom, is going to form, and that's when it comes up above ground. So now, if you see the mushrooms, you know that that fungi is going to be in that area in the ground. It's going to produce a tightly packed dikaryotic hyphae, and then in some cells within the mushroom, the haploid nuclei in the dikaryotic hyphae are going to fuse, and they become diploid. The diploid cells within the mushroom then undergo meiosis and produce haploid spores. When the spores land on a hospitable place, then they start to grow as haploid hyphae again, and the cycle is going to be completed. So it's going to go into the ground and is going to start all over again. So what's going to be the largest living organism in the world? Well, believe it or not, it's actually going to be a fungus. So specifically, it's going to be what's referred to as a yellow honey mushroom fungus that covers an area of about 10 square kilometers or 4 square miles. And as far as we know, the largest one's going to be in eastern Oregon. This fungus is going to be estimated to be about 2,400 years old. And it could be as old as 8,000 years old, which would place it in the category as one of the oldest living organisms. But we're not sure. So moreover, by area, fungus is going to be the largest. So here is going to be a picture of a yellow honey mushroom fungus in eastern Oregon. And so it's going to be one of the largest and longest living on Earth. What you see is going to be the fruiting bodies here that are going to be above ground. What consists of most of this organism is underground, where you can't see it. Now with the fungi, like we said, they're going to digest the food outside of their body, and then they're going to absorb it into the body and use the nutrients from there. So they're going to secrete strong enzymes that break down this organic material that's decomposing. So how can they grow in so many habitats? Well, that's an advantage of being a decomposer. There's always going to be things around it that are dead and decaying. So they don't need light. They have hyphae, which will last underground and then start to grow when conditions are right. And they're going to be extremely important in our ecological role because they're there to decompose all of that dead, decaying matter. Mycosis is going to be a fungal parasite that can cause disease. So decomposers versus parasites. So if you break down dead stuff, you're a decomposer. But if you break down tissue of a living organism, you're considered a parasite because you're harming that organism. So mycosis is going to be a type of fungus that actually is going to harm living organisms by breaking down the tissue of that organism. Now we can actually find this on humans and other animals. It's going to be things such as athlete's foot, jock itch, beard itch, scalp itch, ringworm, toenail fungus, and even a yeast infection. So these fungi get their nutrition by digesting some of the organic molecules within your body. It's going to be very, very contagious. They're spread by spores that can linger in moist surfaces. That's why they say make sure that you wear shoes in the shower when you go away to college, or if you're in a gym or a locker room, make sure something's on your feet, because if somebody walks through that has athlete's foot, that can spread very easily to whoever walks behind them between cleanings. It also tends to be a problem in places, like we said, like dormitories, gymnasiums, and fitness centers. Also, playing different sports. Things such as ringworm, which is going to be a fungus on the skin, can actually be spread through touch. And so things such as football, or if you have wrestling, anything like that where you have direct contact with others, can spread this fungus infection. There's something called a sick building syndrome. And in this situation, this is going to be where people are living and working in a building that experience a variety of unpleasant symptoms. Sometimes they can have burning or watering eyes. They keep a runny nose. They might have itchy skin or allergic reactions. More severe effects such as cancer, miscarriages, and probably produced by these toxins that are being released by the funguses that are growing in that building. It could be in the walls, it could be in the ventilation system, or it could be in the materials that are found within that building. And so it does get spread through the air system or ventilation system, even if it was due to, at first, mildewed clothes or papers or something like that that became wet. With mold contamination, sometimes they actually have to get a special type of group to come in and to remove this mold. Lots of times they do have to evacuate that area because it can become very hazardous to people's health to be in those areas. There are going to be beneficial fungi, like we've talked about. We have Mycelium, which is going to create penicillin. That was one of the first antibiotics that was discovered, and so that's going to be used against bacterial infections, and it's considered to be a wonder drug. Most plants are going to have fungal symbionts. We have what's referred to as a mycorrhizae. This is going to be round structures and fibers that are closely associated with the fine rootlets and root hairs. Some mycorrhizae have hyphae that are going to press closely against the walls or root hair cells. Others are going to send hyphae through the root cell walls and then into the space between the cell wall and the plasma membrane of a plant. And it can be beneficial because as it's working together with this plant, it's going to actually, they'll work in a symbiotic relationship and help feed each other. These have been found to be 400 million year old fossils in early land plants. So it goes way, way back to where these are actually working together. And so looking here, you see this fungus growing with this plant. You see the hyphae growing around the root hair. It's going to go in between the different cells and then interweave between. So with this, researchers investigating the invasive velvet leaf plant evaluated how well offspring survived. They're going to compare the survival of offspring from parents grown with and without the symbiote root fungi that are going to help it grow. And so looking here, you notice the days since planting and the ones that have the mycorrhizal parents versus the non-mycorrhizal parents. At first, it doesn't seem to be much of a difference, but over time, it does seem to help them grow a lot better and stay alive. And that finishes us up for Unit 2. We'll go on to Unit 3 next week.